Welcome to Fearlessly Feral Living. This is Reverend Karen broadcasting to you from the Woogie Ranch out here in the back 40 of northwestern Nevada, where I'm a half an hour away from the nearest gas station and the nearest grocery store. This is a podcast devoted to using new thought principles to ensure successful creative living. Fearlessly Feral is a focused ministry of centers for spiritual living and is devoted to a vision of a world in which everyone lives fearlessly feral, or if you prefer, wild and free. We blend spirituality and psychology to work from the inside out to promote successful, wild, and free living. Our mission is to provide a strong and unshakable inner foundation that works for long-term successful living. Our purpose is activating inner self-awareness to live unlimited lives. And we do this by talking about spiritual principles in practical ways so they are applicable to everyday living. And today I want to talk about prosperity consciousness. The principles embodied in this topic are the creative process and spiritual beings. We're all creative and we're all spiritual beings. The practices are self-awareness, forgiveness through compassion, and practicing the presence, or what I call oneness. This particular episode was inspired by a phone call and a subsequent conversation on Facebook about said phone call. First, the phone call. I officiate a lot of weddings, and I specialize in elopements. So it's not unusual to get a phone call from a couple wanting to get married the same day or within a couple days of the initial call. That doesn't bother me. And it is also not unusual that one of the first questions a couple asks is, "What do you charge to do a wedding?" That doesn't bother me either. I'm used to it. And I've come to see this question as an opportunity to open a line of communication with them. Particularly since I know that the reason most couples ask that question is because they don't know what else to ask. So I guide them through and we talk about it. Also, it's not unusual to get asked for a discount, but this particular couple took things a bit further, and they did so in a way that, well, let's just say, they prompted this podcast. First, they called while on the road in their car on a Saturday, which meant they would have to go to Reno to get their wedding license, since that's the only place where the local county clerk's office open on Oh my goodness. They'd have to go to Reno to get their wedding license, since that's the only place where the local county clerk is open to issue wedding licenses. Now, Reno's about an hour away from where they wanted to get married, and they were coming from the opposite direction. And I didn't make those rules. A wedding, while tender and sacred, is also a legal act, and one needs to get legal paperwork in order to get married. And the county clerks are the ones who issue such legal paperwork. I just do the ceremony and sign the license. I'm just the officiant here, not the legal beagle, just the minister. Anyway, this couple was not happy about that. They begged me to issue the license, and I said, no, sorry, not sorry, but no. Actually, I didn't say that, but I thought it because I was already beginning to get an inkling that this might be one of those couples. But here's the kicker. I told them how much I charged, and they responded with this: "Can you do it for free? We're broke, but we're in love." And I said, "No, I won't work for free." And they hung up on me. That's an example of a poor prosperity consciousness. What's called a teaching moment in my world. It's also an example of rudeness, but that's for another day. That couple, of course, is not teachable. They hung up on me. They're not teachable, but maybe somebody else is. So I decided to do this podcast because this kind of consciousness is pretty common. And I can illustrate that further by talking about what happened next here. I posted this little hang-up story on Facebook, thinking it was entertaining ultimately, because it was, and that I might spread some laughter around. Instead, I got many folks who shared similar experiences. Folks who had been hung up on or discounted or somehow been rude to because They wanted to charge a fee for what they do for a living. So I compiled a very formal list of industries based on all the folks who responded to that single post on my Facebook wall. You ready? Here you go. Web designer, therapist, attorney, photographers, tractor guys, veterinarians, mythologists, horseback riding instructors, caterers, artists of all types, editors, window dressing designers, hang glider rental place, musicians, tattoo artists, bagpipe players, stand-up comedians, public speakers of all sorts, and last but not least, teachers and facilitators. And ministers. Oh my God, the ministers. I don't know why people expect us to work for free, but they do. Whew. Just as an aside, I have really cool and talented friends on Facebook because I don't post publicly. So all those people who responded to me, those are all my friends on Facebook. And it was simultaneously comforting to know that I wasn't alone in such situations, but also frustrating to realize that there's so many folks out there asking for free or discounted services. Being on the receiving end of such requests does not feel good. For me, even though I know such requests are more about them than me, I can't help but feel undervalued and disrespected when I'm asked to provide a service for free or discounted, particularly when they're rude about it. The truth is, I give of my time and my talent quite frequently. It is part of who and what I am. And quite frankly, I'm happy to give a discount to someone if I feel it's merited. But I still won't work for free. And I especially won't do it for people who feel entitled. All of this leads me to think we might just have a problem in this world with prosperity consciousness. And of course, we also have a problem with entitlement. But for this podcast, I'm going to stick to the prosperity consciousness piece. Another minister nailed it when he commented, that mindset is why they are broke. Indeed. This speaks to the heart of prosperity consciousness. Now, before you get all activated, which means upset, mad, angry, sad, or bothered in any way, by what I'm saying here, let me clarify. I'm not saying that everyone who asks for a discount has a poor prosperity consciousness. Things happen. I get it. I've been there. And I learned how to accept help with grace and dignity through those times. That's not what I'm speaking to here. I'm speaking to folks who think that because they are in love and broke, that a minister should marry them for free. I'm speaking to folks who think that because they love hang gliding, they should get the glider rental for free. I'm speaking to folks who think that because it is art of some form, it shouldn't cost very much. I'm speaking to folks who think they should always get something for free or a discount because they're entitled. I'm speaking to folks who think everything is too expensive. And I'm speaking to folks who would rather complain about prices and place blame for prices they think are too high and think they deserve to pay a lower price or no price at all. And I'm speaking mostly to people who have a pattern of asking for free or discounted services because they've been broke their entire lives. If you've been broke your whole life, there's a message inherent in there. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't have to be that way. That's what this podcast is all about. So in the interest of enlarging the prosperity consciousness of the world, and maybe even of you, I offer up the following tidbits, tools, and references for improving one's prosperity consciousness. First, I want to speak to that phrase, prosperity consciousness, because, it's a bit jargony. First of all, prosperity isn't just about money. It's about a way of being. It's about how we show up in the world. And that leads me to consciousness. You hear this word consciousness a lot in New Thought. My own master's degree is in consciousness studies, a whole program of study devoted to consciousness. So here's my definition of the word. Consciousness is who and what we are at all levels, mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. How we do one thing is how we do everything. It's kind of like that phrase, which is attributed to Anonymous and a whole bunch of different people. Watch your thoughts before they become your words. Watch your words, for they become your actions. Watch your actions, for they become your habits. Watch your habits, for they become your character. And watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. Our thoughts, words, actions, habits, and character are all our consciousness. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, because it's true. They do. All those things do create our destiny. What we think and be on the inside is what creates the outer circumstances of our lives. And secondly, it means we are at choice in determining just how prosperous we shall be in our lives, just how successful. Why and how are we at choice? Because we can determine and choose our thoughts. We can choose our words. We can choose our actions. We can choose our habits. We are at choice for all of that stuff. So, a little while ago I said how we do one thing is how we do everything. Here's an example of that. If we're cheap in one area, it's likely we're going to be cheap in all areas. How we do one thing is how we do everything. We can't be cheap financially and not be cheap, for example, in the area of relationships. We are the same on all levels. Mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. Our consciousness is the same across the board. So if we are physically cheap and not wanting to pay full price or thinking things cost too much, guess what? We get to explore and see if we might be cheap in giving love and attention to our family, for example. We get to explore if we might be cheap in giving good self-care to ourselves, for example. We might be cheap in thinking we don't deserve nice things. We might see lack and limitation everywhere if we have that consciousness. On the other hand, a person who has a high prosperity consciousness, that person will be generous with their love and attention. They will see abundance everywhere they look, and they will tend to be grateful for what they have, rather than resentful for what they don't have. And of course, they'll be prosperous. That's consciousness, and that's how it works in our lives. So our now infamous couple probably shouldn't be getting married, because sooner or later that love they claim to have right now is going to go to where all good things go when a person has a poor prosperity consciousness, buried under layers of entitlement and blame and misplaced expectations. So unless that couple becomes teachable and is willing to go within and explore their own consciousness and change it, well, they're in for a world of hurt. I'll restate it because this stuff is important. If we are experiencing lack and limitation in any area of our lives, chances are we have a lack and limitation consciousness, and we will be experiencing lack and limitation in a lot of areas of our lives. So what do we do about it? Well, the first step is to become aware of it. Once awareness sets in, then we are at choice. We can do something about it. So how do we become aware of something? Well, there's lots of ways to do that. We can journal, we can get spiritual coaching, we can get therapy, we can sit in the silence and listen, we can meditate, we can do all that kind of stuff. But we can also simply pay attention. Every day, pay attention. We look at the circumstances of our lives. We ask ourselves, are there areas in my life where I find myself saying things like, I can't, or I won't? Is there a pattern there? For example, is everything too expensive in my world? What's up with that? Everything? That's a pattern. Do I have a belief that others don't deserve to be paid well? If that's the case, then do I have a belief that I don't deserve to be paid well? Or maybe I just think everything is too expensive because the entire world is going to hell in a handbasket and I don't appreciate any of the changes that have happened. Maybe I'm one of those people who goes on Facebook and posts in all capital letters, what is happening to our country? And then I leave because I begin to get answers I don't like. and I shut down my Facebook account, thus creating more lack and limitation in my life. Well, that's one way of doing it. We shut ourselves off from our own higher consciousness when we do stuff like that. We get stuck. We limit ourselves. What we consider to be high prices are just a part of our own self-created limitation consciousness. These examples are some of the kinds of questions we can ask ourselves when we're exploring this. Do I lack gratitude for the good in my life? Do I lament what I don't have more than I express appreciation for what I do have? Is it difficult to see or realize or find anything good in my life? Do I ask for discounts all the time or for free services? Do I believe that there are only so many resources and that some people always will have more than others? There's only so much to go around? All good questions to ask ourselves. Eric Butterworth, in his book called Spiritual Economics, has this to say: we must begin to face the possibility that financial problems may be the outer manifestation of inner states of consciousness. I love that. I think he nailed it. But here's where it gets yummy, because all this limitation consciousness is a call. It's a catalyst. It's a plea. It's an invitation from something deep inside of you to move into a different way of being. I've got news for you, honey. If you're listening to this, it is no accident that you are here. Ask yourself those difficult questions. Because when we ask ourselves these kinds of questions, this is where we can begin to create something new and wonderful in our lives. So we first become aware of our own consciousness of lack, and then we become willing to make a change. But not an outer change, an inner one. We change our consciousness, and we do that by first changing our thoughts, one thought at a time. And here's where the beauty of this teaching called New Thought comes in. Because the phrase, change your thinking, change your life, that came from us. It's a bit cliche now. I know it's in all the commercials. Yeah, it's a cliche. But it came from us, from Science of Mind. We change our thinking to change our lives. Now, you might be thinking that this is a rather simplistic view of a very complex thing. And yes and no. I can't get very complex in a podcast format. I just can't. If you want to go deeper, take a class or get a coach. The best way I have to illustrate this is from my own personal experience. So when I prepared to do this podcast and got the idea for it, I went and pulled out all my books on prosperity and abundance. I have 17 books on prosperity and abundance. I had to laugh at myself. Now, you might be asking why I have 17 books on prosperity and abundance, and I'll tell you why. Because there was a time in my life when I had a very poor prosperity consciousness. During that time, I got all those books to help me improve that poor consciousness. By the way, I'll be putting a list of those books in my show notes, along with a few choice quotes that I love. This list also does not include my everyday go-to books like the Science of Mind textbook or any other of Ernest Holmes' literature. So yeah, I've had times in my life where lack was the predominant consciousness. In fact, I had my own personal self-installed glass ceiling. I could get so far in life and then boom, I'd hit that glass ceiling and fall back down to the bottom. I'd achieve so much success and then I'd bump up against that ceiling and that would be it. And I'd have to start all over again. I could go no further. It happened over and over and over again. I began to think that I could not progress in life unless I experienced loss and change and disaster and catastrophe. Oh my God, I was such a drama queen. Anyway, I had to remove that glass ceiling. Now, my personal glass ceiling, which contributed to my poor prosperity consciousness, was low self-worth, lack of self-esteem. It didn't matter how successful I was. It didn't matter how smart I was. It didn't matter how much I achieved against all odds, which I did over and over and over again. I still experienced financial difficulties. One year I made $250,000 in my photography business. That's $250,000, guys. Guess what? I still had problems paying my bills that year. That's a poor prosperity consciousness. I still had trouble in relationships. I could get in them okay, but I certainly couldn't maintain them. I had trouble in other areas of my life too. All of that was a direct result of a consciousness of lack and limitation that stemmed from my own conviction that I was unworthy of anything better. I was smart and I knew it. I got really far in a business that most people thought was not viable. I made a good, full-time living from photography for almost 30 years. But I still had that glass ceiling and I bumped up against it on a regular basis. It really helps to be aware of this stuff about ourselves. And it wasn't until awareness of my own unworthiness set in that I was able to do something about it. Because we can't fight that stuff. We can't fight things like unworthiness or grief or illness. We accept it and we learn from it. We don't stuff it. We don't argue with it. It's there. Deal with it. Really. Now, I'm not saying your limitation consciousness comes from low self-worth. It could be coming from something else. Old beliefs installed by parental units, maybe. Or maybe some healing about something in your past that needs to be healed. It could be anything. The point is, if you have a limitation consciousness, that's really an invitation to move into something more expansive, something greater, something more fun. Okay, back to the journey from limitation consciousness to prosperity consciousness. I began studying science of mind in earnest. I was taking classes, and I learned about affirmative prayer, and I began to use that in my life, and I began to affirm abundance and prosperity, and things began to improve, but I wasn't working on my consciousness. Back then, I still really wasn't aware of how low my self-esteem was. Lower than a snake's belly in a ditch. That's where my self-esteem was. And here's the deal. I think the key to prosperity is awareness and a consciousness of who we really are in this world. Not what we do, but what we be. And so I had to become aware that I thought so little of myself, that I was blocking my own good. Because once we become aware of something, we can change it. Now here's the next key to prosperity consciousness. Knowing who and what we really are in this world. One. And I've got that in all capital letters in my notes here. You know all those quotes that talk about oneness? If you're studying New Thought, you see it everywhere. Here's a quote that you might be familiar with that speaks to this. I am. That's it. I am. It's a simple way of stating a very profound and powerful spiritual principle. Although I know that most of us tend to complicate this principle with doubt and lack of confidence and fear, this principle is stated as oneness. Oneness is one of those things that's difficult to describe because it's big and it affects us on all levels. What I am speaking to when I speak of oneness is our knowingness that we are, as Ernest Holmes said, unique and individualized centers of God consciousness. Each of us is part of that divine entity known as God. If God is the ocean, we're a drop of water. We are part of it. So we have this awareness of self and we have oneness, which is basically awareness of God, and awareness that God is a part of us. So if we become aware of ourselves as a unique center of God consciousness, we might be less inclined to limit that. Healing a consciousness of lack comes from a consciousness of oneness. Because if we believe we're one with God, then we must also believe that we all embody the same qualities that God embodies. Things like love and wisdom and power and beauty and joy and, yes, prosperity. And it stands to reason that by having a consciousness of lack and limitation, we're denying that very part of us that is the best part. We're standing in the way of our own good. So in order to experience a prosperous life, we must first know our worthiness. I could go on and on about prosperity consciousness, but this is a start. If you're experiencing any sort of lack in your life, whether it be financial lack or lack of good health or lack of good relationships, the place to begin to transform it is with an awareness of self and a consciousness of who and what we really are in this world. One last little thing. You know all those books about prosperity that I mentioned earlier? Turns out every last one of them mentions forgiveness. And many of them devote an entire chapter to the concept of forgiveness. In fact, I would go so far as to say that any book about forgiveness is really a book about prosperity. Because we can't be prosperous in our lives if we do not forgive. So we're back to awareness, this time awareness of where in our lives are we refusing to forgive. And anytime I speak of forgiveness, whether it's in a talk or a workshop or a retreat or something I've written, I feel the need to say this. Forgiveness is probably the most difficult spiritual practice we can do. It's also the most rewarding. Forgiveness is huge, as big as the sky and beyond. So if you do nothing else to expand your prosperity consciousness, try forgiveness. But it works better if you do the entire thing. Personal self-awareness, a consciousness of oneness, and forgiveness. That, in a nutshell, is the key to prosperity and abundance in our lives. Again, this is a very superficial exploration of each one of these principles. The truth is, in a podcast format, one can only go so deep. Take a dive into what it means to be personally self-aware. Take a dive into what it means to have a consciousness of oneness. Take a dive in what it would do for you in your life if you forgave everything and everyone completely. Do any one of these things and watch the prosperity and abundance levels in your life rise up. In the show notes, I have a list of 17 books on prosperity and abundance. And in those notes, I've included some quotes from some of them, so you can see the emphasis of each book. Perhaps something will resonate with you and you will be moved to purchase one of these books and explore things a bit deeper. In the meantime, I am knowing fearlessly feral living for you and for me. You can find more information about what I'm up to. Hit fearlesslyferal.org. That's the web address, fearlesslyferal.org. And I thank you so much for listening. Namaste.